Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
You wanting to take this away, or do you want to move around?
I'll just move around.
Great.
Hello.
Micrófono.
Hello. Yeah, okay, that's better.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can you bring up my slides? Oh, there you go. Okay. So I'm the one standing between all of you and lunch. And so I will make this a very provocative talk. Right? So I want to talk about the future of work, the future of the workplace. Next slide, please. Next slide, yeah, yes. My name is Ashok. In the south of India, the first name comes last and the family name comes first. So that's why it says Krish Ashok. I head the digital workplace and workplace reimagination practice. And I essentially advise customers on how to transform the workplace so that you are ready for digital disruption. Because a common mistake that many companies make is that they invest in customer experience. They invest all their dollars on customer experience, but very little on employee experience. Okay? Now, unless you really reimagine employee experience, you will really not be able to transform yourself digitally. Right? In addition to what I do at work, I also play heavy metal guitar and write and compose songs in a 3,000-year-old language called Sanskrit, which is like Latin. So that's what I do outside of work. Next slide, please. So I am part of an organization at TCS that essentially looks at business and technology services all the way from infrastructure, IoT, cybersecurity, blockchain. Once more. Analytics, insights, automation, and once more, please. And design, workplace, and conversational, right? So I head digital workplace. So next slide. I want to talk to you about why the workplace is changing, right? The reason the workplace is changing is that we are living in completely different times. There is nothing in the past that can teach us how to deal with this particular disruption, right? And the disruption is not just in terms of technology. Technology started the disruption, but a lot of the changes are cultural and social, right? So next slide. Let's start with the very first thing. At this point, there are over 3 billion people on Facebook, right? If you include WhatsApp, that gets to almost 4 billion people. Now, this is both good and bad, right? We thought it was all good till about 2-3 years ago. And then everything went down, and we've realized that social media has a negative impact on a lot of things, on society, on politics, on fake news, also on children's brain development, right? So there's both good and bad. But why this is important for us to understand is that 100 years ago, our grandparents apparently never met more than 100 or 120 people in their lives. They never interacted with more than 100 people in their entire lives. And they did not travel more than 25 miles from their place of birth. Okay? And now, on Twitter and Facebook, you can connect and interact with millions, if not billions of people. Now, that level of collaboration never existed before. That level of sharing of information never existed before. So this idea of building collaboration networks has no other precedent in history for us to learn from. This is completely new, right? And the interesting thing is that companies and company cultures were built in the pre-Facebook generation, right? So we still don't understand the full value of digital collaboration. Next slide. The second really radically important thing that is happening is that there is nothing you cannot learn on YouTube. Anything from carpentry to music. I learned to play the cello by watching videos on YouTube. Y yo aprendo español con una aplicación Duolingo. But most of my actual listening experience to Spanish is unfortunately Narcos or Netflix, so and that's not very polite language. Maybe I should watch more telenovelas. But the interesting thing is that we are at a point of time when there's nothing you cannot learn. You do not have to go to a university. You do not have to go to a polytechnic to learn any skill. You can learn everything from machine learning, artificial intelligence, big data, robotics, and kids are already doing it, right? So this is a very different period of time when you don't need institutions to actually get factual knowledge. Okay. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yes. Yeah. So what is interesting is that we're at a time when more people are taking courses from Harvard and MIT and Stanford and the best universities online. People from Pakistan and Bangladesh and India and Philippines and every part of Asia, every part of Latin America, they are accessing a lot of this knowledge completely online. And that's not the interesting part. Stanford recently estimated that when their computer science course was made available to people globally over the internet, over Coursera and so on, the smartest student was not physically in Stanford. In fact, the smartest student at Stanford was 400 ranks below the smartest person who took the course online. Right? Which therefore also means the nature of talent is completely changing. Your employees are not the smartest people you could possibly have. The smartest people are on the edges. The smartest people are not graduating from the best universities. The smartest people are picking up skills when they need to pick them up, and they are learning and unlearning new skills at a really fast pace. Right? Next slide. Because we're also living in times when IT and technology is more democratized than ever. Kids are building iPhone apps. Kids are founding startups. I learned iPhone programming from an 11-year-old kid on YouTube who has more than 1 million subscribers. He makes close to $4,000 of monthly revenue from YouTube advertisements. He's sitting in Silicon Valley, and he's just a high school student, not even a high school student, a medium school student, right? Now, what is interesting is that this is not because kids are becoming smart. It's not the case. It's because technology is becoming simpler, right? So that's the interesting thing. The access to technology, the ability for a wider group of people to embrace technology is changing the world. Now, this is particularly important. All of you running massive companies have IT departments. To be fair, we help a lot of those companies with IT. The fascinating thing is that in the next 5 to 10 years, technology is not something that only the IT department will do, but everyone has to do. As a generation of people growing up with digital technologies, as technology gets simpler, as you have to build new products and customer experiences at a faster and faster pace, IT cannot be the only people doing technology. Everybody has to do technology, right? Everybody has to do business. Everybody has to do technology. So this is a very radical shift from a world where we only specialized, right? There used to be this joke that we are now getting to the point where doctors are not just ear, nose, and throat. There are doctors that do only nose and only one nostril. So we've specialized so much because there is so much specialized knowledge, but we are now headed towards a world where people need more general knowledge. People need to be able to switch between roles very, very rapidly. Next slide. The reason a lot of this is being driven is that the business models of the future, digital-only business models, look nothing like the earlier business models. Many of us are part of enterprises that have 100, 200-year-old histories, right? We understand manufacturing, we understand traditional knowledge work, we understand how to do sales, we understand how to marshal large numbers of people, etc., right? And yet, we are now in a world where this video game company with maybe 30 or 35 employees is able to build a digital-only product that made $750 million in its first 24 hours after launch. Let me give you some perspective. The movie Titanic made $1 billion of revenue in 10 years. It made about $300 million in its, in the first few months, and then DVD and TV and all the rest of that. And it took 1,300 people to make the Titanic. It took maybe 30 or 40 people to make Fallout 4, the video game, right? They did not have to sell DVDs. It's a direct digital online-only download. What is interesting is that purely digital-only businesses look nothing like non-digital businesses, right? And as traditional companies transition to digital, this is what they're up against. They're not up against your competition who's also doing digital. Your competition is purely digital companies that understand or remember nothing from the analog world, right? So as everything becomes software, the interesting thing is that when you used to have a data center, you had to deal with machines and network and cable and wire and air conditioning. When that moved to the cloud, you only have to deal with software, right? When artificial intelligence and AI and automation will come in, everything will become software. You don't have to physically deal with robots. You only have to deal with the software, right? When everything becomes software, when 3D printing comes and in the next 10 or 20 years, you will realize that software is pretty much the only thing that every business needs to deal with, right? So this is, and your competition will be companies that have never had a history of doing anything other than software. Right? Next slide. Which brings us to this idea of disruptive automation. Right? Now, what you're actually seeing here is a warehouse, is an Amazon warehouse in the US. Okay? Now, the interesting story here is that till some years back, any of you who understand retail, warehouses did not look like this. Warehouses were a little bit more organized. They had shelves. You go to one corridor, one aisle, all electronic products, all iPads in one place, and so on. But if you notice, there are not too many human beings because all those orange things are robots. They carry those entire shelves to the person who will pick the product and ship it to you. Right? Now, the interesting story here is not that they're using robots in a warehouse. That's going to come, right? There will be more and more robots doing this. The interesting story here, and that should scare us, is the fact that over time, they realized that we were designing warehouses for human beings. We were not designing them for robots. For a human being, you need to have proper, easy to accessible shelves so that it's easy to go pick up things. But a robot has potentially infinite memory. It can remember where objects are. So you don't need to arrange a warehouse. Why do you need to waste money arranging a warehouse when you can just place things randomly? Again, they also figured out that if everybody buys iPads during Christmas, it makes sense to place all the iPads as far away as possible so that the robots don't get into a traffic jam. And so they're more efficient, right? The reason I'm talking about this is that our thinking about digital disruption and the way we need to transform the workplace, if it is based on our historical knowledge, our ideas of how people collaborate, of how we make decisions with data, all of that will be wrong because this is an example of design by data for machines. None of this could have been designed by a human being. It was designed by data algorithms that looked at optimization values and then decided that this is the most logical way to design a warehouse, right? So you will have more and more of such examples of machines using data to design for other machines. And that leaves human employees with a completely new role to play. A new role that is fundamentally more creative, more empathetic, and more importantly, the ability to make sure the machines don't have these blind spots, these odd mistakes that can happen when you really roll out artificial intelligence on a wider scale, and that will start to happen. So this new role, a lot of new roles in organizations will be human beings who are trainers and mentors of artificial intelligence. So low-end employees may not be there, but these new roles will be created. Nowhere close to the number of jobs that will exist, but that's a different conversation. Next slide. Now, if you can play the video, just click once more. Next slide, and yeah.
Hello,
Yeah.
I'm Alexa. The device is convenient, but it's also raising concerns over security and privacy.
You have a child who is talking and accidentally orders something because the device isn't aware that it's a child versus a parent.
Which is exactly what happened today during our morning show when Jim and Linda were talking about a child who accidentally bought a dollhouse and 4 pounds of cookies.
I love the little girl's take on it. Alexa ordered me a dollhouse.
As soon as Jim said that, viewers all over San Diego started complaining their Echo devices had tried to order dollhouses.
So the interesting story here was that a child accidentally ended up ordering a dollhouse using Alexa. And then there was a news story about it. And the news anchor said, hey, I like how the girl said, hey, Alexa, order me a dollhouse. And in many houses that had their Alexa next to the TV, those Alexas started ordering dollhouses. Right? Now, the story here really demonstrates one thing, is that a lot of fear of AI, a lot of fear of a lot of these newer technologies, we must realize that a lot of this is still in a very, very early stage, right? The only interesting challenge is that today's problems have become very different, right? To debug this problem is not something that one company could do, right? Because the natural language software is running somewhere else, the cloud is running somewhere else, the retail giant is sitting somewhere else, and the TV company is perhaps running Android TV. And so on. So you can find that the new world of problems, digital problems, will be ecosystem-based. They will not be single company problems. The hardest and most complex problems will often involve collaboration between companies, right? And this is a new world because we have grown in the last 100 or 200 years by having a security ecosystem that ensures that we literally do not collaborate with anyone outside of very, very narrow collaboration boundaries. Next slide. So, having shown you all of these examples, right, and having talked to many customers and many COOs and many CEOs around the world grappling with these problems within Fortune 500 companies, what are the best organizations starting to do, right? Next slide. The very first thing is about embracing enterprise agile. Okay? Now, historically, many of you who have some exposure to IT will realize that agile is an IT thing, right? What used to take longer, you do in an agile way, so you do it in a smaller amount of time. You think in terms of minimum viable products. You never change the deadline, you only change the scope. And it was something that IT projects did. Right? The new realization is that enterprise agile has to be something that you embrace as a culture across the organization. Right? Now, what does enterprise agile actually mean? Next slide. The key thing about thinking about enterprise agile is that you take any business problem, any business process, right? And you ask yourself 3 questions. How critical or how deep is my team's business knowledge? Is this something that I can apply only in a local location, or is it something that I can distribute globally? Can I use a combination of AI and human beings, or do I only need human beings to have this business knowledge? Second is, how volatile are these requirements? Do I have to react to market demands on a daily basis? A retailer may have to react to market demand in terms of minutes. Makes sense for algorithms to really run there. But you might have other industries where it takes a longer time for you to change requirements. And also, do you have a commonly understood agile way of working, right? You have teams that are cross-functional, that are not from traditional departments, but you mix people with multiple skills, right? So based on these answers to these 3 questions, you could either have agile teams that are completely located in a single location, or you could have people who are distributed across multiple locations, and you use video conferencing and those kinds of technologies, to the world where you're fully distributed, where you are able to run your business with any group of people and a combination of AI anywhere in the world, so you have a 24/7, all time zones kind of a coverage, right? Based on the answers to these questions. And it's really about figuring out ways in which you can plan time zones, you can deploy unified collaboration tools where people don't have to necessarily come to an office every day. And you also embrace something that we call DevOps automation. In other words, the employee of the future is not someone who either does only business strategy, only IT and technology or only operations. The employee of the future is someone who does all three. And that needs a completely new kind of employee and new ways in which you think about team structures and how you divide work, right? So how do we get to those things? Next slide. The very first thing that's happening is, historically, companies are organized into teams. These are hierarchies. They have budgets, they have deadlines, and if you don't complete your work on time, you will be fired and so on, right? But these teams rarely communicate or collaborate with each other, especially if they are in different departments. Digital changes the game, because digital, it's imperative that you essentially have people who are across departments who are able to come together to solve a problem, because digital problems are ecosystem problems and you cannot solve them in the older way. So which means that you have to encourage within your companies the formation of what we call clans. Clans are multi-talented people who are across teams who can come together and do innovation, right? And have the empowerment to take an idea to execution without having to go through traditional permission, workflow and other approvals. The third kind of organization is what we call tribes. What is interesting now is that when you take an insurance company from, say, 5 years ago, a person in an underwriting department has a completely different skill set and role than somebody sitting in IT or somebody sitting in the front office sales, right? Now, in the new world, in the digital world, what's happening is all of these are coming together. The person who's underwriting needs to understand big data. The person who's doing sales and marketing also needs to understand big data. So there is now a lot of common digital skills that everyone needs to have, right? In addition to their specialization, there is now a growing set of industry-agnostic common skills. You can in fact say big data analytics, machine learning, cloud, digital marketing. There's about maybe 10 or 11 of these skills that every employee in every organization needs to have if they are to be relevant in the new world. Next slide. So which means that you have to figure out a way to inspire your employees to be generalists and not specialists, right? The Amazon example is fascinating because anybody with 20 or 30 years of retail warehouse experience is the one who is obsolete. But the kid with 3 years of big data and machine learning experience was able to solve the retail warehouse optimization problem, because new digital problems require new skills, and the longer you have experience in a given area, the more likely you will be obsolete. Again, don't get me wrong, I still want my brain surgeon to be a specialist. I don't want him to be a generalist. But most enterprise roles, most typical roles within large enterprises are now trending towards generalist kind of roles, where every 3 months you have to deal with a new digital disruption, a new business model, the ability to design new products and services on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, and not something that takes years. And more often than not, digital and software is at the heart of everything you do, from marketing to finance, to operations, to IT, and obviously everywhere else, right? Next slide. Which means that it becomes critical for all of your organizations to transform this idea of learning, right? Education does not happen only in school or in colleges or in universities or inside classrooms that you have inside your workplaces, right? The average amount of attention span a human being has for a YouTube video is less than 5 minutes. If you expect your employees to learn new skills by sitting in classrooms, it will never work. The new future of learning is just in time and just what you need learning, right? You don't need to learn everything to do digital. You only need to learn the 3 things that you need to solve a given problem. It's a fundamentally new way to think about problem solving, and that is what you need to inculcate in your employees. This idea that the skills of the future are not things you do a PhD in, but the 3 most important things that you learn to solve a given problem. It's actually no different from the way you learn music, right? You don't learn 3 years of music theory to play your first song. You pick the simplest song, you learn the 3 chords you need to play that song, and you learn that song and you play it for your girlfriend or boyfriend. And that's the same approach that we're now starting to see be useful in digital upskilling. And this is not just within enterprises, within society as well, where we need to train a lot more people in digital awareness, not just from a technology standpoint, but from a social, cultural, cyber security standpoint. This new world where roles will not just be in business or technology or operations, but an intersection of all three. Right? Next slide. Which means that the employee of the future also has what we call a T-shaped skill profile. Historically, the one that you see the longest is my specialization, and then I start picking other skills that are adjacent and relevant to that. Now, this is a sample of a role from within our own organization where we felt that the IT developer of the future is not someone who just has one narrow skill, but a lot of common skills from user experience design to cloud, to big data, to system administration. So it's interesting that this idea of thinking in terms of a T-shaped skill profile is the only thing that will prevent people from losing their jobs to digital obsolescence, right? Because you now have a more all-round role, and your role is fundamentally more creative and collaborative, and you're not doing something that is transactional because that will be automated by AI. Right? Next slide. So, which brings us to automation itself, is that a lot of focus on automation also has to be around day-to-day workplace productivity. It's one thing to obviously automate things on the factory floor. It's one thing to automate things because it is safer with automation than it is with human beings. But the really critical, really useful view of automation is that if my employees are doing something that is likely to get automated in the next 2 years, you are sitting on top of a huge problem, right? You're creating a generation of employees who will not be able to pick up newer skills, right? So automate as much as you possibly can with bots and other internal forms of automation that allows employees to focus more on learning new skills, focus on improving their T-shaped skill profile so that they're more relevant within their industry that is getting constantly disrupted. Next slide. So what do you also do as an individual, right? So one is advice to companies. How does an individual employee, what sort of advice would we give to individuals? Next slide. The very first thing is that recognize that if you're in a department, in a given role, you are probably headed for obsolescence, which means that unless you are ambiently aware of the entire end-to-end view of what your organization does across departments, right? This new view of organizations creating teams across departments that are focused on one element of customer experience is the new way of organizing people, and it means that people need to be ambiently aware. The second one is quite interesting. You know, many of you will have children here. What used to be called attention deficit is now called continuous partial attention, right? In that the smartest people are ones who can divide their time and pick up multiple skills, can learn and innovate at the same time, can do both design and engineering, can do business and operations, right? So this idea of an individual being able to consciously practice that is very, very critical, right? And if you want to learn, all you have to do is observe your children. They naturally practice continuous partial attention. Next slide. The second rather interesting thing is that a lot of people who are worried about how do we upskill ourselves for the digital world, oh, it's a very completely different new thing that we have no historical, and I said we have no historical basis, but there is something to learn from, right? In that prior to the Industrial Revolution and schools telling us that you should only learn mathematics and science and accounting and a few narrow skills, right? As opposed to a general purpose, multi-skilled environment that focused a lot on art and literature and design and rhetoric and logic and so on, that happened during the Renaissance period. Although it was accessible only to a small elite, it's interesting that we're now seeing that that's the kind of education that we need to go back to. In other words, that the idea of a Renaissance person was someone who was a master at multiple skills. This is a person with a really brilliant T-shaped skill profile because he was an artist, architect, poet, priest, linguist, philosopher, and cryptographer, and he was world-class at every one of these things. Right? Now, the interesting thing is that in a world that's really, really focused on specialization, We continuously tell people, please ignore art, please ignore this, please ignore, focus only on this, focus only on IT, and within IT only on database, and on database only on Oracle, and so on. This is becoming the problem that needs to be changed, right? So this is conscious awareness. Now the third, next slide, is embracing an individual culture that you cannot learn without experimentation, right? Classroom learning and learning for learning's sake is not something that will ever work, right? I can learn all the Spanish I can on Duolingo, but unless I actually order tacos at a restaurant in Mexico City, I will never actually learn the language, and this is no different. Most companies keep learning and innovation as two separate departments. The very first thing is you got to merge them. People who are learning new things should apply that learning on an innovation project, and you should have the appetite to fail because you just have people who are learning, right? That's the only way to really drive this kind of culture. The second important thing is that coding is not just for the IT department. Everyone needs to understand digital. Everyone needs to understand how technology works. With millennials, that knowledge will naturally be there. But amongst your older workforce, particularly Gen Y and Gen X workforce, digital awareness and the awareness of how technology works is not great, right? So this is something which means that a lot more people have to understand how technology works, not just the IT department. The third aspect is quite fascinating. Third aspect is at the heart of Agile. Build essentially talks about how you can take an idea, you can experiment with it, you can build something with it, and you can really take it to market really fast. You can experiment fast, you can fail fast. You have a culture where failure is celebrated, right? In fact, within the Tata Group, in our annual innovation awards, one of the most prestigious awards is the most daring failure ever. So there's a special innovation award category that awards the most daring failure, the most product that really tried new things, did not work. A new initiative that did not quite kick off. We want to recognize the fact that disruptive things happen, and most disruptive things will fail, right? And last but not the least, you've got to be able to repeat this fast so you have a culture where you're able to bring all of this together, right? Next slide. And last but not the least, if you leave this presentation and you just want to remember one thing that you want to tell your employees, that, hey, I heard this talk on the future of work, and the one thing I remember from that is that he asked all of us to do this, is to learn statistics. Many of us obviously already know statistics to a level, but remember, the foundation of digital, the most disruptive digital technologies today, everything from blockchain to artificial intelligence to machine learning to deep learning to robotics to automation, everything is predicated on simple linear algebra and statistics. The ability to understand how machine learning or deep learning works is predicated on understanding high school statistics, which most of us simply forget, right? So it's not coding that you have to understand. That's the easy part. 10-year-olds are able to build iPhone apps. That part is simple. It's the foundation for a lot of those things that is happening in the future. Next slide. And so with that, just a simple summary of what I do at TCS. My group heads essentially builds new age, employee experiences, agile collaboration and knowledge ecosystems, persuasive and immersive experiences in HoloLens and virtual reality and so on, and also advises customers on exactly how to retrain their employees for the digital world, end-to-end, all the way from user experience to the infrastructure. So next slide. Thank you.
Ashok, thank you so much for this so complete presentation. It can seem a little bit overwhelming. I mean, you've described what everybody needs to do and the significant changes that have taken place.
Yes.
And maybe a lot of us are lagging behind, be it personally or be it institutionally.
Yes.
Can we be optimistic in terms of thinking that maybe if we're lagging, we have an opportunity to leapfrog and actually jump far ahead instead of having to go through all this learning?
Absolutely. So there are two things, right? One is that there was a McKinsey study that recently said that on the face of it, it would seem like we are spending billions of dollars on digital. Every company, every industry. The fascinating thing is that the actual productivity and transformational impact of digital has not even begun to scratch the surface. We're still mostly doing digital at a cosmetic level. Okay. So therefore, we have a great opportunity because we still haven't got there. So many of your competitors are still doing digital at a cosmetic level. So there's a tremendous opportunity to obviously get there. So it's not too late. The second element is that, as I said, a lot of the new learning is not about learning new things, but first and foremost about unlearning old things. So that's a very different paradigm. And when you learn new things, you don't have to learn such a large amount at all, right? We went through 4-year college degrees to learn some engineering, but to build a machine learning software for, say, image recognition today takes about 1 week of learning. So there is a complete paradigm shift. It's recognizing that a lot of newer disruptions can be learned in a much quicker time. So that's also very sort of, it should be something that people can take optimistically. That no, it's not too late, right? And obviously it's very possible.
Excellent. And you know what, Ashok, one thing that astonished me about your title, a few years back, I would have never have just dreamed that someone would have a title with the word reimagination on it. So I think it reflects a lot of what you have expressed today, a lot of what you have shared with us, and it's really taking imagination to the next level.
Thank you.
And not letting anybody be limited by the paradigms of the past.
Absolutely.
Or the learnings of the past.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Damas y caballeros, fue Ashok Krish, Head of Social Media and Workplace Reimagination Practice de Tata Consultancy.